Hello everyone and welcome to the podcast. Today I'll be speaking to Joel Chilaka, medicine student at Sussex University and studying a Masters at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I first heard about Joel when I attended a launch event for Turning Point UK in Nottingham on March 12th, where he spoke alongside Turning Point USA founder Charlie Kirk, Candace Owens and George Farmer. At this event I learned that Joel, like me, hails from Stoke-on-Trent. That's where our discussion will begin. Then we'll move on to the values and aims of the Turning Point movement, and I'm sure we'll discuss some broader issues as well. So without further ado, Joel, it's great to be talking to you.
Nice to talk to you too, Ben.
Good, I'm glad to hear it. Yeah, so to begin with, I think, did you say that you grew up in Trent Vale, was it, in Stoke-on-Trent?
Yeah, in Trent Vale. So I was born in Nigeria, and then my parents moved over to London for a bit, and then I think about 5 or 6 moved up to Trent Vale. Lived in a few different places in Stoke, but Trent Vale was a major place. And then for about 14 years, that would have been all through most of primary school. Went to Stoke Minster School, then went to the Willows Primary School. Then in secondary school, went to, I don't know if you know, NTHS on the edge of Silverdale for about a year and a half. Then moved to St. Peter's where my sisters and brothers had gone to. And then the last 2 years, I went to Denson, just outside in Alton Towers, and then from there went to uni. So that's kind of 15 years growing up in Stoke. And that was a really crucial time for me, shaping my kind of political experience and my thoughts and views on the world, really.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting to me when I talk to somebody who's from Stoke-on-Trent and they're not from the Labour Party, they're not a solid Labour voter. How do you think that your time in Stoke influenced your political views, and why do you think you haven't gone down that route of being a kind of solid Labour working class?
For me, that's exactly the point, was that everyone I seemed to meet with, I mean, I didn't become politically aware really till about maybe 16, 17. And then it was that point, it was just that everyone I seemed to talk to was voting Labour, supporting Labour. The Tories were, and they have steadily grown over. I mean, Stoke South, they finally had now the first Conservative MP in 83 years, I think it was.
Yeah, that's my constituency.
But yeah, it was just weird to me to have this idea of a monoculture, because, I mean, given Stoke's history, pottery town, etc., industrial town that had gone and done many changes, and so a lot of people ended up out of work, having to find work in other places, etc., because they moved away from those industries. You kind of think, though, if you're willing to give just one political party dominance for 80-something years, or even longer, let's say, because I didn't look further back than that, and give them dominance, but then you're not happy with maybe the quality of your education, or your even things at local council, like your schools, or the waste, when they wanted to move the King's Hall to Hanley, and then they wasted £1 million, I think it was, something like that. There was, I mean, I didn't look into it, but the articles about the waste the Labour Council were going to use to move things over to a certain area, or their council buildings, then moved back and decided not to, and eventually now they have, I think it's now City Central they've got now. But all of that time, you're just thinking, well, but then at the same time, you'd contrast that kind of, we believe in the Labour Party and we always back them regardless. I mean, you could have put any candidate up for Labour, and I think during the time I lived there, they would have got in every seat possible. But then you think, okay, so that's one thing, you've got a monoculture. But then if you're not happy with things, surely for me as a logical person, I'm sure most people will be well, if it's always been one group in charge at MP level, at local council level, even PCC, all these things that matter to people, if it's always the one party you vote for and you're not happy with the result, whilst the whole narrative of the Tory governments underfunded you, there's been times when we had Labour governments in that period as well, and Stoke still hasn't always got a huge share of investment or been massively developed as a result. So for me, it was just kind of baffling to be thinking, okay, you think this, but then you've now gone and still voted Labour, and they're still complaining. It didn't make sense. So actually, this is a secret. I don't tell many people this. I actually joined the Stoke-on-Trent Labour Party for a year. I didn't attend many of the meetings, but when I was 16, I said, well, if I want to become involved in politics, I wasn't even thinking of doing anything major at this point. It was just because I thought people have died for my right to vote. It's only worth it that I invest my time to look into, the different parties. So I joined for a year, and I get the leaflets at the door, I get the letters, some of the membership stuff. There'll be invites to, I think Miliband was crazy at the time, or other people, coming down and things, Ed Balls. And I'd see that. Then I did that membership for a year. Then I did the Conservative Party membership for a year. And then I was like, okay, now I need to make a decision. And for me, the Conservative was the natural party, because I was just thinking, you're voting for a party that essentially is saying to people, we're the ones that will give you just about enough that you're content. But if you want more than that, we're not the ones for you. Whereas the Conservatives, at least, I mean, maybe it was easier because they're in opposition. We're always pushing the aspiration of we will make Stoke better. I think their current tagline is building a better Stoke-on-Trent. I just kind of think, when I contrasted the two, for me, it was a no-brainer, really. It was the party of saying, well, if you work hard and really put the skills in, then we're going to push you further, rather than the party that seemed to accept the fact that Stoke was a deprived area and that things weren't always great for people growing up there, and that's the way it could only ever be. That was the narrative it seemed to be, but we're challenging the Tories, so it's fine, but never really making any much progress. Do you see what I'm coming from?
Yeah, I think a result of the kind of Labour complacency in areas like Stoke-on-Trent has been reflected in developments in the city over the last few years. So obviously, as you say, there's a stronger Conservative presence, but there's also this really interesting phenomenon of the city independence on the city council. So it's kind of a paradox, but they call themselves a city independence, but it's a grouping of MPs, former Labour, Conservative. I think there's an ex-Green and an ex-UKIP councillor on that council, and they're quite strong actually. And I'm probably
they're really strong, and they're usually at least when I remember the last local election, they're usually the ones that can the kingmakers in terms of who runs the council. They've always gone with Labour, but that's one of the major things, because even though obviously I mean I've left the Conservative Party now actually in the last 2 weeks, but even though I'm more Conservative leaning, the whole point is that there's no monopoly on good ideas. So if the city independents come up with better ways, efficient ways to run the council, then I'm all for it. It's just that I would hate to be trapped in this block of cycle of always voting for Labour and then them not delivering, blaming someone else. But then 4 years later, you put them back in power. And like you said, they get complacent, so they can afford to wait for 80-something years. They didn't really put up a campaign against Jack Barrington because they didn't think he'd win. And then suddenly he comes in there, and then you're thinking, oh, crap. And then that's when they finally start to pay attention. But I don't think politics should work like that. I think it should be that the good ideas get to the forefront of politics and people are able to see them rather than just through party colours. So even though I'm obviously coming from this approach as I'm right wing, I'm conservative, the city independents have better ways that work for local people to run the city. That's also a preference compared to just, Labour dominating and then not really doing much.
Yeah, and I think that the city independents reflect a feeling, and I can't speak for a lot of these former industrial towns across the Midlands and the North, but certainly with Stoke-on-Trent, there's a feeling that nobody else is going to help us. We've been forgotten about by Westminster for so long, so we're going to do it for ourselves and have this kind of independent mindedness. And I think you see that in a productive way on the council, but you also see that in a different way with the Brexit vote. I mean, this is a solid Labour area, and yet it's the Brexit capital of Britain.
Exactly. And so that for me is another interesting paradox, that even though Labour now currently seem to have this internal battle where their metropolitan London central party and party HQ is talking about doing a second referendum, and I just think, how would I go? I mean, people I speak to in Stoke, I was back home recently because my parents do a lot of stuff with church and things in Stoke. I was back home about 3.5 weeks ago. I just thought, even though a lot of people who go to my church or who I see from school or whatever vote Labour, they are disgusted at the idea that their votes don't matter. So you'd think that a Labour heartland, the Workers' Party, as Labour has traditionally always been, and was proud of that reputation, to then say to these same people, well, you voted for us and you've helped us. We basically counted on your vote without much campaigning for the last however years. We've not even really cared to turn up. They put Tristram Hunt in there, who was, look, now he's now gone on to be director of the V&A. I don't think he was from Stoke at all. It doesn't mean you have to be from Stoke to be the MP. But during this time there, a lot of people, even Labour members and people I knew, were like, he's not really doing much for Stoke, and then went instantly. For the Labour Party to then be saying now to these people, after all your commitment to us, we're still fighting this internal battle to basically discount your vote and say you didn't know what you were voting for and do it again, is why things like the Brexit Party are going to have such a strong resonance across these areas, because Labour seems to have drifted from its working class background to now this kind of Islington dinner set that's forgotten these people and doesn't really seem to have any clear message for them. Even the idea of socialism, I think, and the policy being put forward by Jeremy Corbyn would harm these people the most, being worse off, because eventually, whilst he comes with tax cuts for the rich and saying, it comes with high taxes for the rich, there's only so much you can tax these people, and then you're going to have to start taxing people who are worse off. And currently, the poorest 10% already paying 50% of their income in tax. How much further can Corbyn go if he wants to nationalise everything, take everything into state control. It's going to cost a lot of money. Let's not talk about the capital flight that would happen. These people will be so much worse off. So for me, I just think it's a crazy time to be involved in politics completely.
Oh, absolutely. We're definitely in a state of flux. But this brings me on really to the wider platform of the Turning Point movement and this kind of grassroots conservative movement. Because the thing that struck me when I came to the event in March was there were these people standing outside, counter protesters, and we'll get onto the free speech issue later.
Mm-hmm.
But calling the movement racist and xenophobic and everything else, and the kind of buzz that's around it in a kind of negative way. I sat down and I think the event was an hour and a half, 2 hours, something like that.
Yeah, about 2 hours.
Yeah. These are the values that you and the people that are around you are espousing are conservative, free marketeer, kind of Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek.
Exactly.
It's
Von
not.
Mises. Mm-hmm.
It's not something that's exactly revolutionary.
No.
It's not something that's particularly new. And I think maybe it's the free speech element that makes it kind of different. But I think one argument that I would make about the fate of places like Stoke-on-Trent is that it's actually the policies of neoliberalism and the kind of small government, non-interventionist side of this economic theory that's actually put Stoke where it is today, which is so deprived with the loss of industry. So is it really the answer, or is it the source of the problem?
I think I would try and make a differentiation between being neoliberal and being free market, because I think neoliberal, personally, I wouldn't identify myself as neoliberal. But what I think, though, that's happened and why, because I think it has to be balanced between, I don't think you can go to one extreme. I wouldn't say I'm a neoliberal. But what I think we've seen, though, that's actually the reason why, like you said, these ideas, people see them as new revolution when actually they're not. It's because the Conservative Party, since Margaret Thatcher, has gone on a journey towards a crony corporatism. So this is the thing where you see, for instance, you see council leaders giving contracts to their family, friends, businesses, whereas they're not value for money for people. This is the thing where you see the government subsidizing huge areas of green industry that don't actually deliver the energy sustainability that we would need for the future. And this is the area where you see where investment that people want doesn't happen. Because, for instance, in a free market scenario, obviously the ideal, in principle, we'd have to see how this would work. But the ideal is that people vote with their feet. So if businesses and investors aren't putting things back into the community in a way that people want, it's not that the state then forces them to do it. It's that people go somewhere else and have other options. But if you only have ever one supplier of everything, only a monopoly by the government that has to be the deliverer of your health service or deliverer of your schooling or all these kind of things, and let's say then the various industries that have gone, then what can you do? So I think actually the problem for me is the crony corporatism that the Conservative Party has been guilty of allowing into, which has seen people who want to stay London-centric based running the country essentially. So, the government says, oh, a new provider is doing this. They're not moving out anywhere. They come maybe build a few roads, build a few schools, and then go back. There's no long-term plan for them. Whereas if people had more of the kind of the power that I think the free market gives them, the freedom that comes along with the free market principles that I believe in, then actually they vote with their feet. And companies that didn't stand for the principles they believed in, they wouldn't support. They wouldn't be forced to support through paying taxes to subsidize. And those companies would then either have to change tack, or new companies that were more in line with what people want would spring up. And obviously that seems kind of idealistic and maybe can be compared to, saying, oh, well, it's just that simple. It's not. I know it would take time and there's a huge change that needs to happen in our system. But we've gone so far to where, for instance, we talk about green energy, and the Conservative government and the government in general, the last 20 years, we've reduced our emissions quite a lot. But look at the Greens the Green Commissioner they hired, who took 600k from some environmental companies to lobby for them because the government ministers weren't making the policy. They were relying on this man alone, his committee, to say this is the company to invest in. So they gave huge amounts of taxpayers' money for companies that weren't really delivering what we want to see in terms of 10%, 20% reliability on sustainable renewable energy. But the consumer has no choice in that. So you just you pay your taxes. The government says to this Green Commissioner, you decide. They do that. Turns out he's taken some money from these companies as well. Surprise, surprise. But in the free market, it would be the case that we want, better environmental standards, or we want companies to invest more in our society. Then we invest our money in them, and the ones we don't agree with, we don't use them as supplies because there's such a range of providers, and there's no barriers to entering the market. Whereas if the government's subsidizing a few green companies, how else could the others enter the market? And I think that can be applied in so many areas that we see because we have to accept that the fact that we're not going back to the era of coal mines, the pottery industry isn't going to suddenly come back in massive popularity to Stoke-on-Trent as a site to build it because it's cheaper to do in China and other places. But other industries can spring up and other companies can be invested in. But if we rely on the state to be the one that's doing everything, then it's not a surprise that if the state is London-centric, the investors, the companies, the commissioners that's picking to make all these policy decisions are London-centric. Why would areas like Stoke-on-Trent in the north get the investment?
But then there was a scandal recently. It was something to do with Twitter and people being blocked from Twitter. It was a mocking of a load of journalists had lost their jobs in media companies in America. A lot of these journalists had been advocates of had said to people in the coal industry, for example, kind of industrial workers who lost stable jobs and had voted for Donald Trump in the kind of Rust Belt areas of the country, because these were journalists who were suggesting, well, these coal miners should just go and learn to code and to keep up with the market and to keep up with industry. And in areas like Stoke-on-Trent, I think that the failure hasn't been propping up through massive subsidies paid for by taxation from the central government industries that are failing and won't be able to keep up with lower prices, say in China. Mm-hmm. It's the failure of the government to provide the conditions whereby the population can be retrained and re-educated into different areas. Because if you look at Stoke-on-Trent today, at the last census in 2011, mm-hmm. 24.2% of all households in the city had no working adults. Mm-hmm. And that shows in stark terms the situation.
No, so maybe I did clarify my point. I'm saying that then by taking money and taxes from these people, but then investing them London-centric companies means they're not then putting the investment and the people don't have control of their money to put the investment into the area. So that's what I mean about that them collecting taxes, because obviously you go to jail if you didn't pay your taxes in Stoke-on-Trent. But then it's all going through, like I said, these London-centric companies, and the investment is all, it's all fintech, it's all these new exciting areas, which is great, and I have no qualms with that as well. But then because these people have paid their taxes in, they don't then have the money or the means to then either support new companies in their area. And if the government's only looking ever London-centric, then of course they wouldn't get any investment. So I'm not saying it's a failure. So what I would just want to clarify is that I think that that's been the failure, but because people have paid their taxes, and paying quite high rates of tax currently, then but then the money's not going back to them in that sense. They don't have the control that I think a free market system with lower taxation would provide for them and provide for new companies to spring up, because they would vote with their feet and vote with their cash. If they're paying it in taxes, then they can't.
Right. So would you support a kind of more localized, so would you support, for example, the devolution drive and the devolution to the cities, so elected city mayors, that sort of thing that were undertaken under
yeah, no, I do support that. I mean, and we've seen some successful examples, Andy Street and others, and they're the Tees Valley mayor. But then the thing is, what really gets me is that people always are quick to blame when things like this go wrong and say it was the idea or the principles behind it. But if you've got, for instance, this is a diversion of it because I study, and this is an area I'm well versed in. I was reading a report about commissioning in NHS, for instance, and the government itself said in 2014 in a report that 87% of its commissioning bodies, the CCGs that it set up, were inefficient or poor. They rated them themselves poor at commissioning services and holding providers, whether these were private providers or NHS trusts, to account. So you think, though, the idea of CCGs and local GPs and local people deciding on their services sounds great on paper. So the actual fault of it isn't, though, the idea or the principle. It's the same time and time again we see that government is worse at running people's lives than people are. But because we have then a whole bureaucracy around it, and then the government from centrally and locally sets these targets, which obviously are good for safety standards, but then can be quite excessive. We've seen that the government said, okay, most of our CCGs are poor at commissioning services. However, there's no alternative, as there would be in a free market, where if you think these guys are bad at doing the job, the logical thing is that they don't carry on doing the same job. But that doesn't happen when the government controls everything that you do. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, but then don't you fall into that trap of you oversimplify the issue? When you say the government is worse at providing a certain service than the private sector. Well, I go back to the question that I asked at the event in Nottingham, which was the NHS and say other services like the postal service, for example, armed forces as well. I mean, there are certain areas where
Yeah,
state has to provide that service.
of
The
course.
NHS feeds the world in terms of care outcomes for its patients. So, do you think sometimes you represent, or the kind of the free marketeer, radical free marketeer, small government kind of tradition reflects the right side of the coin of the two kind of economic true religions? So you've got the socialists on one side who say, "Oh, those dirty capitalists, we need to nationalise everything," and then the right wingers say to the left wingers, "Well, you dirty socialists, we need to privatise everything." Don't you think that it's somewhere the truth is always somewhere in the middle?
Of course, and that's why I said I wouldn't go to neoliberalism, which says that all services must be fully free market, because I do think there are some things that make a nation has to provide, like you said, defence, health, etc. But the way you provide it, I think you can apply the free market principles, especially in areas where it's failing. Because I mean, people do talk about the NHS being, as you said, there's not much comparable data that you can use like for like. So the claim of NHS being the best in the world does have some truth, but these tables also do show the NHS to be a failing system in a lot of areas as well, in some outcomes as well compared to other countries. I mean, there are many reports in the Lancet, others that show that we can learn better from other countries. And like you said, and I actually agree with you in the sense that it can't just be one dogma. But what I think the failing has been, fine, we have a national health system. I don't want to privatize that. And that's why I made a very clear distinction between privatization, which is what I think the Labour Party used to complacently kind of get people into not thinking of any new ideas of how to run the service. They just say funding, because then people think privatization means my sick grandmother is going to have to pay at the point of use for a service like a private healthcare you would, right? But I think that's disingenuous. Whereas, as we've seen, some successful and unsuccessful, I'm not biased in any way. There are lessons to be learned from examples of where private companies have run NHS services, positive and negative. But if we just say, well, okay, the system is failing in areas, and also thinking long term, that actually the people in NHS know, that government ministers know, that even the opposition know it's not a sustainable settlement at the moment to deliver the kind of care that we need, and also to deliver more of a preventative kind of service rather than a reactive to treatment service. That actually we can't just keep saying put more and more money in, because the money's going to come more and more from hardworking people paying taxes. And so Theresa May announced 20 billion. Whilst electorally that looks great if I was in the Tory party, but yeah, I'd be putting the leaflets everywhere saying the Tories are going to fund the NHS to the rafters. But are you going to get 20 billion pounds worth of quality or 20 billion pounds worth of improvement from it if there's so much waste and inefficiency? No. So we have to think of doing something different. So I wouldn't say I'm rather on one end or the other, which is why I laugh when a lot of people call Turning Point extreme. But we just think that the free market ideas that have been tried and tested in different degrees can be applied in many of the services that we see that don't deliver for people value for money and aren't efficient.
Well, one of the ranking systems that I tend to look at is the Commonwealth Health Fund. They do a performance ranking of all the kind of major healthcare systems around the world. And the UK ranks pretty highly on all of those. And in fact, I think I read that the NHS with less funding produces better outcomes than the German and French systems. Or
as a proportion of GDP, it spends less, and in some areas produces better outcomes. But then that's why I said some of these areas that we used to compare. For instance, so I'm looking at a report by Kristen Nemitz, which used OECD data, the Lancet and Eurocare data on, for instance, survival cancer rates, strokes, and other measures. It was a report published in 2016 when Owen Paterson was, I think he was chairman of comparing health outcomes. And so you look at, for instance, the UK on breast cancer mortality rates, 23rd, compared to the best country, 10.6%, which is still good. Like, don't get me wrong, we're doing very well. So this is the thing. I always get wary when I see people trying to run NHS, because I want to be a doctor in the NHS at the end of the day. However, I just think that all we ever get from the left side, and maybe you disagree, is it's more money. Whereas I think actually it's better ideas and more money, but only in response to better ideas that deserve the funding. Do you see what I mean? You can't keep doing the same thing that we've done for 48 years for a system that was intended in 1948 for that setting, and trying to apply the same thing now and think that just putting more and more money will get you better outcomes and get you closer to the top of the system. And because we do see in so many areas, whilst we have some great outcomes, and I think we should celebrate them, we should be proud of the doctors and nurses in our health service, there are other areas that we're failing on that we could be doing better for the amount of money that we put in anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's definitely a space in the NHS for public-private partnerships on certain
Yeah.
contracts, things like that.
Hmm.
And one thing I definitely agree with you on when you talk about crony capitalism are things like private finance initiatives
Yeah,
and the massive contracts are awarded to
which
companies
we're
that
still
aren't
paying off now.
yeah, and the contracts that are awarded to companies like Carillion that aren't really public sector but aren't really private sector, and that
Hmm.
just don't benefit anybody.
Yeah. So this is the thing. I mean, the idea obviously sounds great, but this is well, sounded great at the time. But that's the whole point of you can't just keep trying to get yourself out of deficit by spending more money or taxing people into oblivion, which you see now. Whereas I think some trusts are still paying, to the tune of 50 million in or every
Yeah.
a year just to service the interest on the debt of their PFI contracts. And you think how many nurses, how many doctors that have bought, and also could we have had the foresight then? And obviously, with hindsight, I can say all this stuff and say, why didn't the Labour minister or even some Tory ministers who commissioned PFI, even though the Conservatives have stopped commissioning PFI and gone on a lower rate than Labour, is
Mm.
that why didn't they have the foresight to see that, well, you don't have the money now, you're borrowing it, which is why I always will go against the kind of socialist idea of buying everything and, well, you tax people, then you have to borrow, and then you pay the debt and the interest by taxing people to pay that interest. You see, it's a vicious cycle where no one gets out of it. And so you do that, and so now you're spending a proportion, an increasing proportion, and it forecasts to increase over the next few years of the taxpayers' money that's supposed to be for health services on just servicing the debt from serving the interest on the debt you owe, which is why I think now what needs to happen for us to have a sustainable system looking to 2050, 2060. I want the NHS to be around 3,000. I want to be there. I mean, I won't be there, but year 3,000, if the NHS to be there, surviving and thriving, and
Mm.
not taking 50% of people's taxes just for a health service, which is where it could end up if we
Yeah.
keep on, asking people to pay more and more and delivering less and less for that money, is that
Mm.
people then take the foresight and say, you know what, this is the amount of money we have. And that's why I said at the turning point event, we need to stop getting drawn into these two camps. So we can only either be a socialist state and therefore the Tories are underfunding it and they're purposely cutting everything because they hate poor people and they want people to die, or the Tory side where actually, no, it's just a case of complete inefficiency. It's finding that balance, and that's why I think the free market principles applied in these areas will actually lead to more value for money, and also reading of the corporatism that you've mentioned so aptly, because that would, I think that would lead us to a system that, like I said, would be on for our kids, grandkids further on. But if we just get stuck in this cycle of funding or the Tories hate the NHS and Labour say put more money in, then we're never going to get anywhere. And it will just be the same thing we've seen repeated for the last 20 years by the last generation of MPs happening again and again and again.
Yeah. Do you think this is an area of divergence between the Turning Point UK movement and the Turning Point USA movement? Because when we talked about this again at the event, I asked the question, then it was Charlie Kirk that responded to me, and then yourself as well. And he made a very good point about how when you've got a system like the American system, right at the cutting edge of the American system is where a lot of the innovation takes place, and a lot of the kind of payer systems around the world take advantage of the innovation that takes place in the US,
Yeah.
even though health outcomes are inferior. So do you think that because in America there isn't that tradition as much of single payer collective solutions to problems in kind of the social realm? Do you think that's a bit of a divergence because we've got institutions like the NHS in this country that have proven to be successful?
Yeah, I mean, when Turning Point launched, we said, the first thing we said is, you know what, the ideas that are coming from Turning Point USA, they're our founding partners, so we're not rubbishing them at all, but we are for the context of the UK. So there's going to be differences because of the setting of where we find ourselves in established, and the aims are similar, but different in the sense of the things that we might target or the areas where we feel as people in the UK are willing to be kind of convinced on, and we can kind of show them where the free market can apply, are going to be different to the US. But also interestingly, Charlie also, in response to your question, I remember, also rubbished the system there, but because of the crony corporatism that's there, that means the government ends up paying huge amounts to these providers who then still keep premiums high. So he said that, you know what, one of the problems with their system, and the same problem with any kind of, that can actually is what gives the free market a bad name, is not the free market principles. Obviously, if we follow them to the letter, I actually think people will be generally better off, as we've seen happen over so many countries over the last 200-300 years when they've been applied in different areas. As he said, in the US health system, one of the major problems is that limits outcomes whilst you get a lot of innovation. is this kind of crony capitalism where 3 or 4 companies get all the money that's, for instance, that comes from the government towards it, and so there's no incentive for them, there's no one to challenge them, which is what the free market would do. I mean, if you're a provider, if you're a consumer in the South America, you've got some option. But if you had more and companies could fall, which is what the free market says, is that if you're not efficient or you're not providing what customers want, you fall, you disappear, and a new company rises up. That doesn't happen in the States. And that was one of the things he said is the reason why outcomes are limited. So we shouldn't just take the US system as, oh, this is what a private system looks at, because as in his own words, it wasn't a good example of a private healthcare system working. Just you know, and I think that's very important that we just don't fall into, as you said, rightly, in those two camps of this is this system or this is this, because in everything there is compromise. And whilst the principles on paper and the principles from philosophers that we try to follow sound great and I think would work if they were followed, as we actually see, because we're human, we don't always follow them, and there is that inherent human greed, or there is that kind of inherent failure to follow them, which leads to companies, because people want to get rich. That's fine, I don't have a problem. Profit's not a bad thing. But then when we get that kind of government subsidizing companies to get even richer and it's just them, then you kind of think, well, that's the reason why the system is not working for people. And that's why I really think here in this country, what the Conservatives need to do in the next 10 years to win back people is actually to stop the state subsidizing so many companies and get rid of the crony corporatism in the state, so we can show people actually the free market does actually deliver those things just when it works, and companies can rise and fall. There's no barriers to entry or exit of the market.
There was a question that, because I came to the event with my girlfriend and then a friend of mine and his partner as well. And a question that he was itching to ask, but he didn't. He was kind of nervous, I think, and he didn't want to get up and ask it. And I said to him, "You'll be kicking yourself now because you won't ask it." Mm-hmm. But as I've got you now, and this is for Will, if he's going to listen to this, Will wanted to ask the question about the liberalisation of drug laws, because it seems to me, you mentioned earlier your Christian faith and that you attend church. Is there a bit of a kind of play-off between two different values there? Because on the free market side, surely the value would be legalise, say, cannabis and regulate it and tax it so that can bring more money in for the government, and it's a free will issue for the individual. But then as well, on a moral, is there a moral dimension to that means the state has a kind of responsibility to its citizens to restrict the usage of drugs, for example?
Yeah, so that's why I said I wouldn't class myself as a liberal, because on drug policy reform, I'm open to the arguments and I'm still listening to them. I would have come probably from a position of no, I mean, because also from a health kind of point of view, a medical point of view, because I don't think that this is, I personally initially wouldn't think this is an area that needs much attention, in the sense that compared to the other problems that we have in society, adding then legalizing drugs. But I'm listening to the arguments and I'm find myself more in the middle. And so that's why, for instance, it's not one of the turning points, campaign points, because we're not to that extent neoliberal. And we also have our differences individually. But the things that we campaign on, things that as a collective group who all believe in the free market, personal responsibility, that we agree with. So there is a case, to say, well, we should give individuals that freedom and then encourage personal responsibility. But I think we've got to a state in our society at the moment that we've taken away so much responsibility from the individual and said the state's in charge of everything. But to then turn around and then legalize drugs, and then when you start with one, perhaps as a gateway to another, I think we need to restore the balance of personal responsibility, where the individual says, I'm in charge of my own health. I'm in charge of, I don't need the government to regulate and tell me how much this is, or how much food to have on my plate, etc., or where my kids should go to school, what they should be taught. And to give that kind of parental responsibility, I think, is lacking in society generally. But also to give that kind of personal responsibility, then I think I'd be more comfortable with a society that was able to legalize drugs, because we would probably see less of the other problems. While the financial side sounds great, there's also that kind of moral societal side that I'm still not fully convinced, and I'm waiting to hear more of the arguments. So I'm not against or for, I'm kind of open to hearing both sides. But I think we need to restore more that sense of personal responsibility, so that even in the face of, where you can walk into a shop and buy weed at any time of the night, or, even anything else, then people would be able to, because I think our generation has grown up a lot, whilst we're more kind of, for ourselves, and, we are, I wouldn't say more selfish, but we're more strong-minded, I think, our generation. And but we've grown up in an area that says, well, the state's doing everything. And so that's one thing that Turning Point is trying to tackle on campuses, is that actually there is a better way. And so I think we need to have that kind of more of that sense of personal responsibility before we could talk about things like legalizing drugs. But no, as I
Yeah.
said, I'm open to hearing the arguments. But and so you'll probably get a different answer if you, for instance, if you'd asked that, it would have been interesting because I think Charlie's when Charlie was asked this question in the States, he's all for legalization, but he doesn't partake himself, and he goes along, like you said, with that I think well-made point of not restricting the individual and also the financial incentive to the state and building more tax revenue. I would say, like I said, I'm not fully against, I'm not fully for, I'm waiting to hear the argument.
Well, yeah, that's a point that I did want to pick up on, actually. I know I brought up, I kind of refer back to your point about your religious belief. And this is something that I've been really looking into over the past kind of getting on for 3 years now. I don't know how familiar you are with Jordan Peterson, but his talks on the role of the individual and the role of faith, whether you believe kind of literally in God or not, there's this argument that he makes for individual responsibility, and a vehicle for that seems to be kind of through Judeo-Christian values in a society. Do you have any kind of specific points that you'd like to make on that?
Not more specific points because I would say I've read as much as Jordan Peterson, but I think I would agree with a lot of his work. And I think what we've seen, so this is where probably then we go to the identity politics and the free speech kind of thing, and the monoculture is developing, not just in universities, but developing in the media, where we've seen Roger Scruton recently get handed out of his job without even the right of reply because a journalist then says, and these things, and the whole point is that if you're going to be tolerant to, and I think the Judeo-Christian values that have built up Western society, I'm not trying to here to proselytize people and tell them they have to be religious. I think it's important that we then just don't denigrate them because we're becoming more liberal. That's great. But I think that those values of democracy, tolerance do stem from that. But it doesn't mean that you have to be religious to follow them. So I would align myself more in the camp of the Petersons of this world, mainly because of my own personal faith and my own beliefs. But I wouldn't then say that has to apply to everyone else. But I think it's kind of sad now. One of the things that's kind of been in the last kind of maybe 20 years we've seen, at least growing up, is the denigrating of Judeo-Christian values has led to a society that has less individual responsibility and puts more on the state or on the collective. And you, for instance, see that with things like knife crime, where you have the crazy situation where head teachers who are saying in their schools, it's not because of kids who have been excluded. If you get we exclude all the kids, but not all of them go and get a knife. Correlation doesn't equal causation. But then we're so easy to try and say blame something else and say it's this fault, and so we need to deal with that, and we need to have aggressive youth strategy and etc. etc. When I didn't grow up in Southeast England, so I can't speak for the experience of black people growing up there. And this will touch on from identity politics later on. But if I found myself without a youth club, I can't see that the next thing I would go and do logically is pick up a knife in the streets. I think it's kind of a big jump. But then we normalise that attitude and we say, well, that's the reason why. Rather than saying to the individuals, it's wrong to carry a knife, having that moral kind of stance of carrying a knife and going out to stab someone is wrong, and asking parents to instill that in their kids, schools to instill that, rather than after the fact saying, well, you have a reason to blame, and it's not your fault really, it's your environment only, and it's not, you've got no responsibility yourself. Obviously, environment does play a role, I'm not denying that, but you see what I mean? So that's where I would agree with Jordan Peterson a lot, and we see that in our society today.
Yeah, I think one interesting point that he's made, and other people, I think, in this kind of intellectual dark web movement as a whole, it's a really interesting point. It's that if you've got, and it's the interplay between personal responsibility and identity politics that we see. If you aren't religious and you can view another human being as not kind of their life as sacred and as equal to yours in a fundamental sense, then you can other them in such a way that identity politics seems to do. I mean, it's amazing at the event in Nottingham, there were people outside. I don't know if you went out as well, but I saw.
So Candice and I went out to go and speak to them. They were interesting, an interesting bunch. So carry on. I don't want to cut you off.
Well, no, but obviously we were both there and saw it, and they're saying you're trying to have a conversation with them. You were trying to invite them into the event, and these people were saying, "Go away, you racist! Go away, Trumpist!" Yeah. I think the cognitive dissonance of calling two black people racists. It beggars belief. The idea that identity politics can go so far as because you're not from my group, then you are the enemy, and you aren't even worth having a conversation with.
I think that's the thing for me. It's that cognitive dissonance that I see so often on the left with many things. So, for instance, I follow this page that posts meme pages, but it's actually people's tweets and
Yeah.
stuff. And so I'm just reading one that I saw about an hour ago. And so this lady posts, she posts a tweet saying, "What's going to? I just yelled at a prick with the audacity to wear a fucking Make America Great Again hat in the middle of a jazz festival. Sorry for my language." And then her comment is, "I don't understand how people can be so hateful. I really don't." And you just think, can you not see in yourself, by you saying or assuming that person wearing that hat is not just someone who voted for a democratically elected president, is a racist, maybe white supremacist, whatever tag you want to add onto it, and then you going out of your way to approach him, shout at him, and yell at him just for wearing a hat, and then say, "I just don't understand how people can be so hateful." That cognitive dissonance we see more than I just find it I think it's frankly amazing, but I think also it's being shown up for what it is. And that's why we see things like Trump being elected and Brexit happening, because these people who seem to be dominating our media, dominating our political sphere, because even though we've got the Conservatives, as we saw with Roger Scruton, they bowed down at the click of a finger to any kind of left-wing criticism rather than standing up for the principles they believe in.
Yeah.
And so but then the silent majority, I think the ordinary people who just want to go about their lives, they see this and they look at a tweet like that and think, from someone who's a blue tick on Twitter, thinking, but surely you're the one being hateful, because if you're preaching tolerance and, you want everyone to get along, you can't just go up to someone who disagrees with you, shout at them just for wearing a hat, and then call them the hateful ones. And that's why I think these kind of left-wing people or their allies, they underestimated the stupidity, the sheer kind of how you just laugh when you see things like this displayed either written or in real life, with the policies of kind of people saying we're anti-racism, but we're going to protest at this event to stop these people speaking, or we're pro-tolerance, but except for your views, or we're pro-free speech, except for when it comes to you. Then I think that silent majority of the country just kind of said, well, we don't want that, we reject this. And then in America, they voted for Trump, whilst he didn't get the popular vote, he got the electoral college. And the same with Brexit, where we were told all of this royal nation would happen, blah, 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 and we were all racist if we were going to vote for it, etc. But people just turned around and said, well, actually, you know what, you're being a bit disingenuous, and we've seen more and more from you. This kind of left wing kind of, I think it's quite, at first I used to think it was quite tame and it wasn't purposeful, but I think it's quite a malicious and purposeful tool used by the left, like identity politics. And there's a cognitive dissonance there. It tries to say to a group of people, we're your allies, we're your friends, anyone else is against you, support us. And people, I think, just deserted them. And it's a real shame the Conservatives are doing what they're doing with Brexit, and also being less and less conservative in my mind. You see a lot of people saying we only win from the centre. Well, actually, I think we win when we're the right of centre, not centre right, but when we're right of centre, where we actually have a platform of policy and principles. And so it's a shame to see that, because I kind of think in the current climate, had the Conservatives delivered properly on the Brexit that people voted for, even though whether it was no deal or deal at the start, the deal wasn't good enough, it got voted down 3 times House of Commons and gone for no deal. If they had been able to give a more robust defence of capitalism and free market principles without the cronyism that we've seen from Conservative and Labour governments over the last 20 years, if they're able to do that, I actually kind of think the Conservatives would have won a majority in the country for a long time. Whether I'm just dreaming, but I think they've just been sensible rather than pandering to this whole kind of left-wing identity politics, anti-tolerant but tolerant people kind of narrative, which confuses a lot of people. Then I actually think they would have done so much better electorally. But maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I think it has been a real learning curve for me, certainly in the last few years. I mean, first of all, one thing that I would want to say on this is I think for people like me and you who are very involved in this stuff day to day, very interested in it, very kind of looking at it with a microscope, because it's something that we're clearly interested in, we wouldn't be having this conversation if we weren't. I think one thing that you can get kind of drawn into is kind of conspiracy theory, as though there's some big pervasive overarching
of course
plot. And that's I say to my friends when I talk about this sort of thing, it'll be, right, guys, I'm going to get my tinfoil hat out now, just to kind of joke about it a little bit and say, look, I'm not crazy. I'm trying to just have a conversation about this and pick up on. I mean, things like, for example, everyone knows the stereotype of the right-wing newspaper that prints untruths at the behest of big media barons. But I mean, I've seen it more recently with the Guardian, for example. The
Mm.
Guardian I used to see as kind of a little more of a step above the tabloids and right wing, more
Mhm.
right wing. But yeah, and is that you laughing that I can hear?
Yeah, that's me laughing. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
carry on, carry on.
I would be laughing at myself. I would be laughing at myself if I was looking at myself a few years ago on this, because some of the things that they printed, and again, this is more through the Jordan Peterson stuff, the intellectual
Hmm.
dark web stuff. These
Yeah.
people are talking about individual responsibility. They're talking about truth. They're talking about freedom of speech,
Hmm.
and they're just getting torn apart
Yeah.
by an organisation that's just completely not committed to truth.
Mm. And that for me is the key point. Whilst I think yes, we don't enough maybe on the right call out when we have the Daily Mail whipping up kind of what people call anti-immigrant hatred. I don't think it's that. And obviously, yes, they might print on truth, but then there's a truth in there that we do need to have an honest discussion about immigration, and that again gets torn apart. And so I think they've gone about it the wrong way. The same way on the left, though, and this is the thing for me, it's at least take the log out of your own eye. While this obviously isn't going to be, like me trying to be moral, at least take the log out of your own eye. If you're going to twist the words of someone just to get a headline, if you're going to have to go to those depths to issue corrections after correction after correction on the transcript of an interview, and I'm still referencing the latest Roger Scruton case, but there's countless number of cases that we see where it's like, this person is this, racist, homophobic, blah, 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 and they just said, oh, I'm thinking about this issue, I'm not fully sold on this. It wasn't ever like that. Or, for instance, you then saying they're anti-tolerant, but you don't accept their view as legitimate. And you just kind of think they've been doing that for years and years, and that's why I feel like I'm saying people are wising up to it, because, like you said rightly, about maybe 5, 6 years ago, it would have been under only those who looked under a microscope who started to notice the discrepancy between these people demanding truth and honesty and being the bastions of pure left-wing compassion, then printing all this stuff and saying all these things that essentially double speak to people.
Yeah.
And even immigration or anything else, you would have noticed it. But now that's why I think more and more people in their day-to-day life, it's not as if the case that they're going on websites and looking and reading, but they hear Jordan Peterson say the individuals should be more responsible for themselves. They hear some of the views he has to have. They don't agree with all of them. Not everyone will, and that's fine. But they don't certainly want to, start trashing him as some phobe or ism, because that's all the left does. So when they hear people on the left do that, more and more people are just kind of saying, this isn't the left wing that I knew or I grew up with. This isn't the honest, compassionate. I mean, this is people who are purposely taking people's words, actions, thoughts, twisting them, and then banning them or trying to stop them from being heard, but then demanding that their own views, their own thoughts are taken seriously. And I think that's what I think more and more is being exposed. And maybe, like I said, maybe because I'm in the middle of it and I pay attention to it more and more, and also because I'm biased because I'm right wing inherently, maybe I see it more. And maybe, like I said, I'm happy to be wrong on that. But I do
Mm.
think there is a case that needs to be made, and more people will be exposed to it. And so that's why Turning Point, I think, is so vitally needed, because whilst people always say this is going to be now or never, I genuinely do worry for two things. Because either we get into a state universities now where we have a left-wing dominance that means that every foreign policy decision is viewed with Israel and America as aggressors who just want to imperialist, and that's the only way it's ever viewed. And we have a whole generation of people who grew up that way. We have a whole generation of people who then delegitimize the state of Israel's existence. We have a whole range of people who say that anything that's white and male is therefore wrong and should pay for the sins of slave owners 300 years ago. And that becomes a dominant narrative that people my age grow up with and leave university with, the people who will be the doctors, the politicians, the lawyers of the future. And that's terrifying. But what's also really frankly terrifying, though, is that in response to that, you then get a really hard right, kind of the whole actual xenophobes, actual white supremacists rising up again in response to that. And people then flock to them for support because no one else is giving them a platform for just people who want to debate ideas and actually be able to think between the two kind of left and right, and also be able to just kind of take ideas on face value rather than be told it's this or another. And so that's my worry, is that we either, and especially why Turning Point is really pushing on university campuses, is that I think we either have this generation of people who then are only ever in this monoculture and never get their ideas challenged as they had done before. And you get a lot of people saying, oh, okay, well, this is like university's always been. But I don't think it's been as bad now as to the point of people being stopped from expressing their views on campuses. There's always been opposition to right-wing views on campuses, as far as I can see from universities in the UK history, but not to the point of being no platform shut down and not being allowed to express those views, not just from a student union level, but also in academia. We're seeing that more and more. So I think that's my one fear, that we then have a generation that's so far left and only sees a one world view because they've only been exposed to that and told that anything else is wrong. But then also my other fear is that then in response to that, we do get the actual hard right, homophobes, racists, white supremacists rising up and even getting more and more attention from people who are fed up of only having that kind of force down their throat, because only half of half of people our age go to university. The other half are there as well. And also within that 50% university, not everyone's going to fall for it. I just don't want then there to be that return to the hard right that we've seen in previous times as well. So that's why I think it's time for people to stand up and say, look, I don't agree with anything that you say, but I will defend to death your right to say it, your right to be heard, and your right to be challenged about
it. Absolutely. And I think that's the danger, because when you've got one side playing identity politics, the kind of intersectional, postmodern,
yeah.
Then you get the guys who are sick of being the white working class guys, the straight guys who are tired of being called oppressors for being white, working class and straight. They go and meet up with other angry white, working class, straight guys, and they form identity politics movements of their own that carry the swastika and are just as hateful on the side of the coin.
And that's the worry.
And on campus as well, I think it's very. I mean, I know with you, it's medicine and it's less in the classroom. So, for example, I'm studying politics, and it's so bad and corrosive for actual debate, because there are so many students on my course that the only thing they ever have to say is that something's Eurocentric or that something's looking through the lens of a straight white male, and that legitimizes it straight away. It's just so it doesn't in the Hegelian sense have one argument going against it and not create something better. Your argument shut down, and then that's it.
Exactly. I think it really cheapens what university in this country and university in general was meant to be, that intellectual rigor that leaves you coming out. So I went to university, as you said, I studied medicine. But even that, I'll give you some examples of that being politicized in a second. But you would then think you go there, and the views that you have before as an 18-year-old straight from sixth form or straight from secondary school, going there, or from college rather, going there, the views you have, you want them to be built up but challenged rigorously, so that when you come out in 3 years, that's what you expect, especially on a humanities course or an arts course. Not to then come up and then basically have to, as a lot of people I know in courses like history, politics, etc., that you said they can walk through university by just saying everything's racist, everything's written by the white man, it's their fault, and therefore this is why. So rather than actually challenging the root of the idea or the topic presented in front of them, a lot of them, they can just say, well, this idea is bad, or this idea doesn't have any more credibility because it was written by X, Y, and Z. And that's not the whole point of ideas. You can't just have a monopoly on ideas and say that they're therefore bad and good because of the author. Actually take us to the root of the idea and let's challenge them. But speaking about medicine, the main thing that's happened is when we get lectures not to do with the anatomy or physiology, but when we get lectures talking about the structure of the NHS and the history about it, and so there was a lecture in second year, and as you can tell, I'm quite not forceful, but I definitely want my views heard. So in a room for a lecture is then going on about how terrible Jeremy Hunt was. Now, when the junior doctor strike was happening, I had completely different view to most of my peers, because I could see the sense of having to, cut your tail according to the size of your coat. You can't spend all the money that you have. And whilst that's unfortunate, right, and I think it could have been better handled, the whole scenario, it definitely wasn't a case of Jeremy Hunt wanting to privatise and, the conspiracy theory that was going around, which I heard on so many left-wing platforms, but I didn't think my lecturer would then say, is that Jeremy Hunt wants to ruin morale so much, so then he can then sell off the NHS to a private company. And this lecturer said that, or word to that effect. And I just had to say, I'm sorry, but this is absolute nonsense, because you're not providing any basis for this. And you're going to have 300 students in this lecture theatre nodding along, and then going on to repeat that to their friends, to their family, who are like, well, my son's a medical student, so, they know. And so then you get this whole kind of uninformed theory going around, and that becomes then, and the thing is, without challenge, it then becomes accepted as the norm. They moved over to window towards that, and then people are then arguing from that point, rather than arguing for more the kind of neutral or balance or fact-based perspective and arguing the issues and the benefits of whether you need to pay doctors more or what you can afford to do unless you want to raise taxes and those kind of things. You then move it to this window where everyone's arguing the point of, well, Hunt's doing this because he wants to ruin our morale, and then therefore a private company come and buy over the service. He wants to purposely ruin the service that he's in charge of to allow private companies to buy it because it'd be so bad that we'll all agree that no one else can run it. And you just kind of think, if this is happening in medicine, this is obviously a rare example. Most of the time I'm dealing with patients who are sick and, talking to them and doing medical stuff. So you don't get much into the politics of things. But if that was able to happen in my medical degree, for someone who's studying humanities or politics, you can see how that can become kind of the everyday norm. And if you are coming to uni centrist or not really interested in politics, I think maybe the next generation are more interested in politics than we were at that age, at least first, second year. But if you're coming to university and you're roughly kind of informed but not too bothered politically, it's very easy to then get swung into this fully left-wing, sold-out kind of perspective without receiving any challenge for 3 years. And as I said, that's the worry for me, is that then in 10 years' time, those people are then the civil servants, the doctors, the lawyers, the politicians of this world, and they've not even bothered, they can't even see eye to eye with anyone who disagrees with them and see why they might disagree with them. They don't have to agree, and that's the whole thing. At least I can speak for myself in Turning Point. We're not asking people to end up having to say, yes, you're right. It's that, yes, you've raised a good point, which challenges mine, let me consider it. That's at least the end goal. Obviously, yes, in a perfect scenario, I want everyone to be free market capitalists like me, because I think that would be the best scenario for the world. But it's that they can at least say, I can see the merits of your argument. Let's talk further. Let's see what we can do to build a better society based on the fact that we disagree, but we are able to sit in a room and talk through these ideas. But then if you get to a scenario where people, mainly on the left, are then saying, well, no, these ideas have no place. This is the thing, have no place in our society kind of thing, is that phrase I hear a lot. Then how can you ever then have this generation of people who will be able to challenge your ideas? And what will that do for the quality of life of people when we've seen capitalism, or at least free market principles, at least in the 200 years, deliver such great improvements in people's quality of life? And now I think the case actually to how we can improve on that rather than regressing and going back to a left-wing dominant society.
Yeah, I think that's why I think this issue is so fundamental. Whether you are left-wing or you're somewhere in the middle, or you are, the principle of free speech should be there for everybody. Because, I mean, for example, at the event in Nottingham, I wish those people had come in, sat down, and listened to what you guys are here to say, because I don't agree with a lot of the economic and some of the kind of the social policies of movements like Turning Point, but I believe in free speech, and I believe in hearing somebody's argument, somebody's points, and having a discussion. If those people had come in, they might have come to the same conclusion that I came to. Yeah. These guys aren't Nazis; they are conservatives with conservative values that are recognisable and that I can understand and at least grapple with. Yeah. But the rejection of the idea of free speech and the idea of individual responsibility of thought is just so kind of corrosive to a society.
And you know what's even worse is that maybe 5-10 years ago, it would have just been the people at Turning Point that received the abuse and the kind of no platforming. But now, even people like you who are just saying, I don't agree with their ideas, as you clearly said, you don't agree with my economic principles and a lot of the social things Turning Point does, but you'll listen to us and you don't have a problem with us having a platform and maybe trying to convince other people. People like you then are now facing, well, you're enablers of this. And, it happened at my students' union. So the students' union president, she is completely left-wing. She was last year. She went to the House of Commons. I mean, if you want someone to represent you, representing the House of Commons is one of the best places your students' union president can represent you. She took a photo with Jacob Rees-Mogg, and then a campaign started to deselect her and remove her from office for merely taking a photo because this enabled the Nazi, right-wing, hateful, homophobic, sexist views of Jacob Rees-Mogg. And you just thought, but you guys elected her because she was left-wing and she espoused these views that she'd work for you. This is how you work for the people you're elected to serve, by sometimes reaching across the aisle. And this wasn't even like a discussion with him. I don't think she'd gone to meet him, and it wasn't because he's not anything to do with universities at the time. But she bumped into him. He's a well-profiled figure. She took a photo and posted it on her personal page, and that was enough to set people off, saying, how dare you legitimize his views? I mean, if you'd spoken to this girl, you would have known that I don't think there was a single point of view that she had with Jacob Rees-Mogg that they shared. But the mere fact that she gave him any sort of platform was enough to have calls for their head. They were unsuccessful because many in the university said this is absolute nonsense. But my theory is that then, as I said, that window moves further and further where this is normalized, and actually people like yourself who even give me the time of day as an interview, I told you either stop doing that or we come after you too, is that unless people stand up and say the enough is enough, then we're going to have a society that can only ever be repressed and controlled by one dominant ideology, and those who don't agree then find themselves, first of all, verbally outcast from society, then pushed out, and then, as we've seen in other communist and socialist regimes, then it can turn maybe violent. And that's, like I said, something that we have to challenge now, because I think we're moving at a speed towards that if we let it go unchallenged.
Well, I think we could go sharing stories about this all day. But you mentioned earlier on that you left the Conservative Party a couple of weeks ago. Now, that surprises me. And have you joined the Brexit Party by any chance?
I have, yes. So that was why I left, because, I'm not sure that Brandon Lewis or anyone will be looking after my social media, but I was posting stuff in support of them. And apparently an email had gone round saying that Conservative members who did that would be expelled, the same way they did to Anne Widdecombe when she became an MEP for them. And so for me, it was a case of, well, if this is going to be the case, who do I back? Such a wide coalition of people from across the left and right who believe in democracy and having the thing that we voted for enacted, or the Conservatives who, frankly, I think now gone as close as they could to not deliver on that vote. So then for me, it was kind of what could have been just, a slight detour to the Brexit Party for the sake of the European elections has now meant that I've left the Conservative Party, because also there's another issue as I outlined. I don't think they've given a strong enough response to these people and these ideas. We've been kind of just tanking toward the left rather than saying, look, you might not vote for us, but look, these are our principles, right? We're conservative. And actually, I think people would vote for us personally, but I think it's better to set up your stall rather than just in response to anything criticism from the left. You just kind of tank and change the policy, or you fire someone or you do something. And so I think that's for me where me and the current batch of Conservative MPs and those who are running the party since CCHQ have diverged. But I have hope, because I think a lot of members I speak to, the people who I was with in the Conservative Party, I feel as if they have their voice, they're just not being the chance to express it. And hopefully the Conservatives can come back to a place where I can vote and campaign for them. I don't know who I'll vote for in the local elections. In my area, it's Labour dominated, so vote Conservative might have done anything anyway. And certainly the European election, I'll be voting Brexit Party.
Yeah. Well, don't you think the Conservative Party is being kind of pushed from both sides? So you've got there are a few people in the Conservative Party, a lot less so than the Labour Party, that kind of want a second vote and everything else. Then you've got the moderates who are saying, okay, we'll get behind some kind of deal with the EU. And then you've got the ERG radicals. How does any lead? I mean, I'm not by any stretch of the imagination defending Theresa May here, but what can a Conservative Party do to bring together people who want no deal and then people who actually wouldn't mind staying in the single market and customs union in a kind of EEA arrangement?
I think what you have to do is that you should have set out your position clearly and stick to your word. So she managed to toe that line after she got elected, which is, what we will push for a deal with the EU. However, if the deal is not satisfactory, we go for no deal, right? And I kind of go back on this history a lot. 2013, Cameron says that he's going to negotiate a mandate for a referendum. And what he'll do before the referendum is try and get a negotiation settlement with the EU they can bring back. And if that's not good enough, then we'll go for a referendum. Does that end up having a referendum? Is elected in 2015 with a lot of UKIPers, because a lot of Tories forget that 2010 we had to go into coalition. So there was no guarantee in 2015 that we would have stomped to a majority by ourselves without the promise of this referendum, which a lot of UKIPers lent their vote, because whilst UKIP surged in 2013 after Cameron had promised a referendum, they then saw their massive decline in 2015 and a Conservative majority. So he did the referendum, he did his part. And I think whilst people give Theresa May sympathy, first of all, she chose to do this job. So you have to know that it's going to be tough, and you have to know the position that you want to be in at the end. And people voted. Cameron, Osborne, May, all the Remainer side, and as well as the Leaver side, essentially framed the European Union for people like me who hadn't given it much thought before as three or four things: the customs union, the single market, European Court of Justice jurisdiction, which meant free movement unlimited across the bloc. Right? They framed the European Union as that, and that you were either in all those things or you're out. Now, a learned scholar might say it's more complicated than that, as more to think about. But this is what they sold us to people in literature in that £9 million leaflet that Cameron sent to everybody's houses. We'd be worse off because we'd be out of all these great institutions that basically bettered our country. And the leave side said actually we'd better off because we stopped paying money into them and we get more money back because we actually run a net deficit with the EU. And so you had that. So I kind of think, well, okay, you've had that, and people have voted to leave. Obviously, they weren't planning for the leave vote, so there was no plan in place. I think that's a shame on both the leave side, but also the Remain government who had campaigned for Remain not to even give the thought that people might actually vote against us and say they want to leave the European Union. And so I think we spent all this time, 3 years, talking about, oh, what does it really mean that we want to leave and blah blah blah. But I actually think, look, you made it very clear to us. You were the politicians that told us these were basically the four institutions. So if any deal doesn't deliver that, then it's not good enough, right? But her deal, half and half does that. I mean, you'll hear different Tories and I get where the toughness comes from because some people accept it, that it does actually leave us out all those four. I personally don't. I don't think it'd be a good deal for the United Kingdom, especially with the backstop, but other areas as well. But then you kind of think, well, okay, fine, you've brought your deal to the House, you've negotiated the deal, but you had said 109 times in the House of Commons that if you didn't get your deal through, you'd go for no deal. So this is where, for me, is the dishonesty in politics that I think then I can't stand for any longer. You put your deal 3 times to the House of Commons, it lost by the biggest defeat in history, and now you're still pushing us an extension. Now, whilst we saw Parliament take control of the House and the Speaker is obviously aiding Parliament to rip up precedent, I still can't get behind the Prime Minister and a party that then says to call the RG radicals when all they want is, fine, some of them might have been angry for no deal the whole time. That's fair enough. That's a fair position to have because it gets out of the EU. But the deal that you tried to push through didn't get voted on, even with looking at the current figures, with all the ERG radicals, as they're called, having voted for the deal, it probably would have still failed by 1 or 2 votes. I think that was latest analysis. How can you then not have gone to the EU and asked for the extension when your solemn promise to the electorate, to the people, was you go for no deal? So I think that whilst initially you could have seen the tightrope it was to walk on and take all the faction in the party, as Ben Bradley quite rightly said, when he was elected, he wrote to number 10 advisors and said, look, we can't have anything that's half-assed, which is what I think this deal is. We'll have to say we want to remain and reform, even against the people's wishes, or we're going to leave, and that means leaving all those things. But obviously Theresa May and her advisors didn't listen and have tried for 3 years to try and get us a half-assed relationship to please everyone, which you can never really do. And so to make these statements to the country, she never does the speeches in Parliament. She does them there. Then she goes and does their speech in number 10 outside, which goes on the 10 o'clock news. To kept on saying on those platforms that reach out to the wide range of the country and the electorate, we will leave a no deal on the 29th of March if my deal doesn't go through. And then on that day, Parliament can suddenly move as quick as that to then frustrate them. I think it was perfectly in her gift to go for no deal, to prepare for no deal. And also, so for me, that is where the crucial is the trust in politics that is being eroded by Theresa May. I think the damage she's doing and those around her, rather than listening to people, they basically tend to be killing off the people around them. Anybody who's a dissident, we don't want to listen to you anymore, etc. They get the whole CCHQ lot involved, you get expelled from the party. I just don't think that's a fair state, especially because we politicians were the ones who gave people a referendum. Whilst Europe was an issue for a lot of people and the UK was on the rise, it was politicians that said, here, tell us what you want on the EU because we can't decide. And then they failed to enact it.
As much as the dedication is there to get this kind of this pure Brexit where you're out of all of the institutions, the single market, customs union, court of justice, everything else. If we're now in a position where there's no majority for people's vote, there's no majority for no deal, there's no majority for Theresa May's deal, something's got to budge. Aren't you in a position now where, because I don't think that Parliament is going to allow this country to leave the European Union with no deal, because all of the economic analysis, and I know this was said during the referendum campaign that if we vote leave, then the UK
And
is
I,
going to sink into the sea
mm-hmm,
and everyone will
mm-hmm,
drown to death.
mm-hmm.
But no deal is a whole different animal altogether. So I don't think Parliament, I don't think the whole kind of, I don't think anybody at the top of British politics is going to allow no deal. So aren't the no deal people, the more radical Brexit people, now in a position where they need to compromise or they lose Brexit?
But I think the idea that we can even lose Brexit after people voted for it and not implement it is fundamentally dishonest. To say that for people to be threatening, which they had been, and I get your point of view, but for politicians to be threatening, well, you voted for something, it wasn't initially binding, we then had a court case, and then we had a bill put through, so people thought this was going to happen. To then turn around to the electorate and say, well, actually, you can't have this now because we couldn't decide now to do it. I don't think it should be an option we even consider on the table, because what does that then do for, if Corbyn gets elected or someone else gets elected or a policy decision happens, we then say, actually, well, no, you know what, we don't like that now, even though people have voted en masse for it. So what's the point of voting? So I think for us to even have the fact that we get rid of Brexit on the table is a deliberate ploy by those who want to remain in the EU to keep dragging this process out long and long enough, hoping that people forget. But I don't think I think they underestimate how much people are saying, even those who voted remain, well, look, you gave us a vote, so now we have to leave the European Union. So I think saying that that would be the option, I think that would be the worst of all worlds, second referendum remaining. However, I'm not averse personally to having a general election where we actually see MPs show their true colours. We've seen the Change UK Tigers, whatever they want to call themselves, now, who had been in the Tory party, some of them, when they were party. Some of them were very clear agitating for a second referendum, which is as a backup, but then not really saying that they wanted that to leave. People like Heidi Allen, Anna Sewell, Sarah Wallison, who said after the election, after referendum, to get elected in 2017, they said, we will respect the result of the referendum, have now come out in their true colours. So I personally, I think the ERGs have compromised a lot, because even for Jacob Rees-Mogg to have backed the deal at the last stages, and a lot of them rode in behind. And as I said, I don't think that and I will be happy to look up this afterwards and see the numbers. But I think that even if all of them had, because the DUP won't, I don't think this deal would have got through, even if all of them had rode in behind. And I'm happy to be corrected on that. But I just think that asking them to compromise when they have compromised on, you told us, the politicians, the Remainers, everyone said it was these four things, and they're happy, for instance, the Malthouse compromise, they did get a majority in the House of Commons. They're not just saying that no deal is like, you end and you suddenly stop being in the EU. It's many deals that you do afterwards in areas that are mutually beneficial. And hopefully pushing their ideal relationship for most of them is a free trade deal with the EU rather than being a member state of the European project, right? So I kind of think, well, they've compromised a lot from if they were, we don't want anything to do with them, we just want to be our England, no contact with the EU whatsoever, which is what they're being painted as, which is patently false. I think they have compromised a lot, and a lot of them did then also tell the Prime Minister, and I mean, for instance, take the DUP, they won't compromise on the Union. So I'm just kind of baffled at the stupidity of Theresa May keeping the backstop in play when, for instance, now we hear that there are other arrangements that can be made. Leo Varadkar said it, the T-shirt, Simon Coveney has been saying these kind of things. There's now rumbles that there could be other ways to solve the Irish border question, which weren't explored for so long. And so you just kind of think, well, you know what, this is a failure of politicians rather than people. And to then say that even the idea you could then go back on their word is even remotely considerable, I just don't think is a route that we want to go down on our politics, because as I said, what these MPs don't realise is that the president they set will be one that whether either people don't vote or if they do vote, they know that, well, if I'm a Tory and Labour gets elected, well, actually, we can just hope and say that actually that wasn't legitimate, we'll do it again, or it was too difficult to actually do, the hard socialist nationalist policies of Jeremy Corbyn, that nationalising everything rather, it's too difficult to do them, or it's not really palatable, so we can't. Do you know what I mean? I mean, how would you then sell that in that scenario? So I think the ERG guys have compromised a lot, and a lot of them did back the deal in the end, I personally wouldn't have done. And they did seek compromise, the Malthouse compromise. They are seeking, not just to be this kind of no contact with the EU. They want to do many deals with the EU, but just rather than us paying money into this block and getting less back, they want to have more control of our money laws and borders. I don't think that is a terrible position to be in. And also because Leave won, whether how big or small the margin of victory was, it was a yes or it was in or out referendum. It wasn't like I said, half in, half out. It was we're either going to be in, which is fully in, and then go the full 9 yards with everything, EU army, whatever else EU wants to do for the next 20 years, we'd stay in that bloc committed to it, or we were out. And so I think then to ask us to compromise on leaving itself, let alone the terms of leaving, is highly disingenuous. And I think that will be a problem down the line that these politicians don't yet realise, which is why I'm not against the idea of a general election.
But then the issues that you're talking about with regards to, say, the future relationship with the EU, they aren't dependent on the withdrawal agreement itself. I understand that the backstop's in there, but then if you're confident that a free trade agreement that satisfies all of the demands of the different Brexiteers can be reached, then why isn't the withdrawal agreement being passed so that then we can get onto that free trade agreement?
Because the withdrawal agreement has been said to be the basis of the political declaration, which is the future of our relationship with the EU. So I think that's something that's been very cleverly missed out. But I don't think you can have this international contract. Basically, this is another treaty we're entering into. And we don't know when it's going to end. We don't have a unilateral exit mechanism. The Attorney General has said that it puts that he's not satisfied with it from a legal standpoint in terms of Northern Ireland. So I don't think you can then say that, well, this won't affect the future relationship and we'll just do the free trade deal. I think it's better to start the negotiations as a third country, but has done this before for 40 years. It's still a good enough position. And so I think too often we also get focused on the London-centric or kind of focusing on is the UK's fault. Is that, well, if the European Union was, so thinking ahead best for its people, you've got the fifth largest trading economy on your doorstep that want to trade with you. I mean, I think everybody's here I've spoken to, none of them are, like I said, these hard right radicals who want nothing to do with the EU. They just don't want to be subject to the EU law, have their laws made in Brussels, and have to pay money in and get less out. That's the core thing. And then, like you said, there are differences in the relationship that some people want or don't want. But the main thing is that if we voted to leave the bloc, doesn't mean we can't do trade deals, but to sign another treaty, people call it withdrawal agreement, but it's actually a new treaty we're signing up to. That will be the basis of our relationship, inevitably, unless we then start to rip up international law. And so I don't think that's a route that the many people in politics were bold enough to do that. Hence my hesitation at signing this agreement and saying, let's just do it, let's just get out of the bloc. Even though we have all these conditions attached, we have a backstop that we don't know when it's going to end. We choose a transition period that ends in 20XX, I think, or maybe that got shortened down. I need to reread any amendments are made. A withdrawal agreement that the EU won't reopen at all. Why aren't we asking more from the EU side? Why aren't we negotiating better? And that's why I think it's best for our country now, given how long it's taken to get to this very poor withdrawal treaty, to leave on a no-deal basis and negotiate a mutually beneficial relationship from there, rather than what this will inevitably become the basis of being another treaty where we are a recipient of rules, a rule taker, but we have no say, no veto at all.
Then the no deal argument that you can leave and then you can negotiate a series of kind of mini deals in certain areas. I mean, the point that's missed there is that if you're outside of the European Union and you've left, it's not like you have any kind of bargaining power. You don't have any kind of negotiation power. If we're in a position now where we've got the 39 billion and all the other commitments that we've made, at least then you've got something to bargain with. Does this?
But aren't those? Sorry to interrupt you, but aren't those the exact reasons why in a no-deal situation we would have that? Because we could say we will pay 39 billion to make a trade deal. I don't think personally I don't think that would be a wrong step to take. And so, you're saying that we have no bargaining power, but I'm just thinking, which we haven't heard much from in our media and other areas, is in a year's time, are German car manufacturers going to find a market for their cars that rapidly? Do you know what I mean? There's so many areas where we do mutually trade deals already, so we have mutual agreements rather, where we benefit from each other, but also we lose out sometimes. That I don't think saying that we have no leverage, no bargaining power is correct, because that's the whole point of we weren't, a small trading nation that wanted to be blocked. We were the fifth largest trading nation in the country, right on the doorstep. We do a lot of things, goods and services, mainly services, passporting, financial sector, servicing comes in London, London being the financial hub of Europe and a lot of the world. And you just kind of think, well, that is our bargaining power. And we're saying, look, we'll even pay £39 billion. We just want a good deal for it. I think that is a good bargaining step, and I'm disappointed it hasn't been better used. Do you see where I'm coming from?
And then, but then again, what it looks like to me is that the EU has shown how effective it is actually as a negotiating power because we're in this situation where we can't decide on anything. The EU is completely unwilling to compromise itself on
Mm-hmm.
single market customs union access without the four freedoms and all of the
Mm-hmm.
regulations with that. And the thing that strikes me is that why wouldn't you want to then stay in? You can't pretend, you can't leave the European Union and then pretend like its rules and regulations don't exist and that we don't do half of our trade with the European Union. Surely
Mm-hmm.
it's better to stay inside and to then you've got a say. You've got a say on the relationship between the UK and the EU, and you're negotiating from the inside rather than leaving and having a lot of these debates and conversations that we're having where the EU isn't going to compromise, and we haven't really got any kind of leverage to force them to.
I do think we have leverage. I just don't think it's been properly applied because
Mm.
what we saw was when the 29th of March date came, and there was talk of it was going to be a 6 month extension, which we now have found ourselves in. When they generally thought, and everyone suddenly thought that Theresa May was actually going to set the mechanism in place and bring a bill to leave with no deal, they gave her the 2 week extension that she'd been asking for because she was going to use that to try and force MPs to say, look, I've extended once. I've only got 2 weeks now. Now focus your mind and do it. They thought she would genuinely pull out and not pay into their systems, not pay them £39 billion. That we would then, whilst tariffs, I'm not in favour of tariffs at all. We would then also put tariffs up because we would have to, because we go back to WTO rules. But we could also use GATT and Article 24 to try and avoid these. But when they generally thought that they were going to lose out on access to our market as well for a lot of things, they then buckled. So whilst I don't, and I credit to the EU, they have negotiated very, very well. They've shown their effectiveness. I wouldn't begrudge them that. But I do think we have not used the leverage that we have effectively. And that's because I think Theresa May generally, she said, as it was very revealing what she said a few months ago, this is the deal I've always wanted. She's always wanted a close relationship with the EU. And I'm not averse to that, but I think it has to become from a close relationship of equal partners rather than a relationship of, well, we take your, which would be the ones you're negotiating out, which is worse. Whereas at least we don't even have a seat on the table at the rule-making process. And I think even going further on, there are many things in the EU that we don't want to be part of with the EU army, with the qualified majority voting they're trying to put in, which would mean that member states could be overruled, so there will be no more sovereign states, essentially. It will become centrally run, and your vote at the table will be meaningless, essentially. I do think that those are the things that we don't want to be part of and are better for us to get out of now. And Theresa May's deal doesn't allow us to do that. It keeps us close in. Like you said, negotiating on the inside would be better. So I have oftentimes thought since seeing this deal, it might be better to remain. I think this remaining is better than this deal. However, because we've democratically voted to leave the European Union, I do think then the only course of action now is a no deal and to seize the opportunities that come with it.
Mm. Well, what do you think happens in the next year then, Joel?
Oh. Now, obviously, I'm going to eat my hat, whatever I say, because it's all going to be wrong. But
Yeah.
I think, first of all, the local elections is Thursday. While people are saying the death of the Tory party, I actually think this might be the last time that they get a high vote share because, the whole campaign to not punish local councillors and also because people won't have the Brexit party standing in their local council. But I genuinely think that this election won't be remarkable in the sense that it won't pull up anything, and Theresa May will still carry on her blinkered kind of bubble as, okay, well, you know what, they gave my councillors, we only lost 200 councillors, or, we kept most of our councillors, so people support me, which seems to be every time she's given a vote, she survives by the skin of her teeth. She takes
Yeah.
that as a pat on the back, well done, carry on doing what you're doing. So I think after that, I think there will be a very kind of defining moment for the Conservative Party and the Labour Party as well, because they've got these 5 million plus Brexiteers in constituencies like Stoke-on-Trent who are hearing the Metropolitan Islington dinner party set talking about second referendum, and now at least we've pushed them to be honest about it. And what I think is fine, you know what, if we lose, we lose, if we end up having a Corbyn government, but I would rather that we campaigned and we were honest about it and lost than, and which obviously a lot of Tories say, well, that's a crap hill to die on, than trying to fudge it. So I think Brexit Party then storms the European elections, which gives people looking at the backside. Nigel Farage is talking about standing in the general election if one should happen. And I just think that the Conservative Party, one of the most successful electoral parties in its history after the European elections, has to take stock and has to say, I mean, look at all these records Theresa May has broken. She's broken the biggest defeat in the House. The no confidence vote was worse than Margaret Thatcher's. She's now got 80, she's triggered the point where enough association members, so the grassroots, have no confidence in her, and want a vote now on her leadership themselves. You know what I mean? All these things are happening. You just got to think, I think inherently politicians want to stay in power, right? So, and they want to, even if they have to go into opposition, they don't want to have their legacy tarnished that they're out of power for 10, 15 years. The Tories found themselves the last time round. So I think that there'll have to be a reckoning within the Conservative Party, and also the Labour Party with those 5 million Brexiteers and those seats, those Labour heartlands who are hearing all this talk as like a referendum. And I think the Brexit Party starts to fill up those votes will cause a swing and cause politicians to finally, wake up and see that whilst we're talking about it and, you're seeing polls, when it actually comes to the ballot box, that anger that I'm seeing when I talk to people across the country, I'm seeing amongst party members, I'm seeing amongst ordinary people who are just saying, well, look, we voted for this. You said you'd give us a deal. The deal didn't pass. So why haven't we left? They will not see this as some kind of political thing that was too difficult. They will see this politicians frustrating the will of the people, as much as that phrase gets bandied around. And I think that then their vote, that anger translating into the ballot box in the European elections will hopefully cause politicians to wake up. And I think we'll move closer towards either a renegotiated deal because with a new Conservative Prime Minister or a new leader, but it might go to general elections. So I mean, it's hard to say what happened. But I do think one thing that is certain is that the Brexit Party clean up at the European elections. And then from there, I think we'll either go to a general, even though no one wants one, it might be the only way to break the deadlock. Or Theresa May is finally ousted and a Conservative leader can then, either reopen the withdrawal agreement if that's impossible, which the EU have said. But the EU says a lot of things are impossible and it's gone back on its own rules. As we saw with Greece, as we've seen with Ireland, we've seen with many countries where the EU set its own rules and then said, actually, no, for this case, we'll make an exception, which has done before. I think either we see them reopening the withdrawal agreement because they now see that actually there is a credible threat that this island, the 5th largest trading nation, I keep mentioning, is on their doorstep willing to walk away with no deal. Then we might get to a better negotiated settlement, or we then do leave with no deal. I mean, I agree with you. I think no one on the top of British politics currently will, which is what the shame is. And that's why I think we could then find ourselves in the general election. But what happens from there, I wouldn't know. So I'm going to eat my hat anyway. The Tories might, storm the local elections, storm the Euros, and everyone says, this deal is great and somebody votes for it. And I could be completely wrong, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah. Well, we're on an hour and a half.
And I'm sure we could go on endlessly. But thanks for taking the time out. I think the free speech bit on campuses, just to kind of shamelessly plug Turning Point. I think we're going to see over the next few months our chapters across universities rising up. And their main aim, as I said, is not to, obviously, yes, the aim is we want to teach out the things that we find, the principles, the economic principles, the social principles, the things that Turning Point, the values that we have, we want to spread them across campus and give them a fair hearing and hopefully have more students come alongside them. But even if they don't, despite that, what we want is more of a university campus where these views can be expressed, where people can have their ideas here. And I think it's quite an exciting time to be part of such a movement. Because when you get so much, I wouldn't call it hate, it's not that. When you get so much kind of the hit pieces, everything from the left wing and also from the centrist conservatives, I think for me, that tells you you're in the right place because you're then standing up for those views, for that debate that we seem to be losing, for that free speech and that tolerance that these people profess to have. But then actually, when it comes to other people's views, they suddenly become intolerant. So I think it's quite an exciting movement to be part of, and I hope that we will talk again and see where Turning Point is maybe in 6 months, a year's time, and see whether any of the things I've said are true or not, or whether they come to fruition.
Yeah, we'll have to check back in future and see how the Turning Point movement is going in the UK and how Brexit and the negotiations are going. So, Joel, thank you for taking the time to talk to me as well. And speak to you soon.